is sort of quite a big chunk of the Brixton Society's area. We probably don't do it enough justice in terms of our walks or publications. Walks are difficult because the remaining sort of historic sites are quite widely scattered, and whatever route we try to plan, there always seems to be a lot of going up and down hills. So, as I said, it tends to be not covered in very great detail actually on the ground. But hopefully I can make up for that this evening. Although, again, the more we do on this subject, the more we find there is to know. And I think I did struggle in putting this together with the size of the file which has built up since I did the very first version of this back in 2015. For those who are still struggling to work out where this first picture is, by the way, this is the modern housing development which eventually replaced the Dick Shepherd Secondary School. But more about that as we get into the text. I'm going to start by taking you back some 200 years or so, and with a description of the underlying estates which shaped the way that the area developed. Going too fast for you? That's it. Right. Okay, well, on the left here is the Lambeth Manor enclosure map of 1810. Not much of the area that we're talking about is actually in Lambeth Manor, but it is a very good sort of snapshot of the pattern of fields and the extent to which there were any buildings in the area at all, which was not very much. There's a very faint yellow outline on the map there, indicating what ended up being Brockwell Park. But I'm talking about a rather larger area than that, mostly to the west of that. And of course, we also have the sort of Brixton Hill area and the old Rush Common, mostly lying to the northwest of this area. And then to the northeast, we have Effra Farm and Herne Hill more generally. The picture or the map on the right shows the way which the area sort of ended up as two major estates, and the different landholders really sort of treated their estates in somewhat different ways. But let me take you through the actual process of that all developing. So as I said, the whole estate was a single entity until 1807, and in fact can be traced back to the manors or farms of Bodley, Upgrove and Scarlets, first recorded way back in the 13th century. As a result of various bequests between 1352 and 1384, the whole estate eventually came into the hands of St Thomas's Hospital, not quite the institution that we know today. In those days, it was a monastic institution, and therefore was shut down by Henry VIII in 1537. And therefore it was sort of given away to various supporters of his and passed through a succession of different hands until eventually in the 1650s it was owned by the Tulse family, who in effect gave the area or the estate its name. So Henry Tulse was Lord Mayor of London in 1684, and after his daughter married Richard Onslow MP, it descended through the Onslow family line. The Onslows seeming to be, I think, almost traditionally sort of speakers of the House of Commons and various other sort of well-connected positions. In 1789, so we're gradually coming closer to that sort of 200-year horizon, most of the estate was sold to William Cole, who some 20 years earlier had actually acquired 16 acres south of the present Brockwell Park, known as Page's Fields, which I think you can probably find on the map, on the right-hand map. I'm afraid the writing is a bit spidery, but it's that area sort of immediately south of Brockwell Park. So I lost my place there. Yes, one of the anomalies is that part at the northern end of the Brockwell estate was actually sold by William Cole to a gentleman named William Winter, who we will catch up with towards the end of this talk. But that may explain why that particular plot is built on and the rest of the area is Brockwell Park.
Sorry to interrupt you, Alan.
Yes.
Sorry. I'm not sure if you've got the captions turned on, and I'm not sure if anyone's monitoring the chat, but there are some people that are watching this that are deaf, so they need the captions turned on, please.
Right. I'm not sure how to do that, to be honest. I don't know if Len can do that for me. I have to say I've not built captions into the PowerPoint unless there's still some there from previously.
Right, my apologies. It's something that we have enabled, and I thought that because it had been enabled, it would happen automatically. If there's anybody out there who knows how to do this, I'd be extremely grateful if they could tell me.
Okay, let me continue just so I can sort of keep to time. On the death of William Cole in 1807, this is the sort of key moment when his large estate was actually split into two parts. So this large estate of 250 acres is divided between Mercy Cressingham, who receives the western part, together with Page's Fields, and the eastern part went to Mr. Cole's brother-in-law, Richard Ogborne. Now, what those people actually did with that land, I'll turn to next. So, looking at the location of this large area of what was then still open land in relation to the city. So here we are looking from Brockwell Park towards the city, and with the Shard and of course the city beyond that. So you can see that this is an area which is potentially on the up, and I think even at that stage people could see that it had potential. So you have here an area of rising ground above the River Effra. In those days it was simply called the Common Sewer. Out here you are away from the smoke and bustle of the city, and the at a time when the built-up area itself only extended as far south as Kennington and Walworth. So you begin to see a movement of the sort of merchant classes and the more well-to-do out of central London, and they're having sort of little country houses or villas put up for themselves on this sort of rising ground immediately south of the city. So areas like Denmark Hill, Herne Hill, what became Tulse Hill, and also across to the west, what eventually became Clapham Park, and beyond Tulse Hill, southwards towards Streatham, you have Rupel Park. So it becomes quite a distinct trend of suburban development. Now, in terms of the Tulse Hill estate, there was a practical problem that it was largely landlocked. So in 1811, Mercy Cressingham had married Dr. Thomas Edwards, and between them they began to develop the Tulse Hill Farm estate, and that really starts in 1814 when Dr. Edwards bought a strip of land to obtain access directly onto Brixton Hill. So that is what we now know as the western end of Upper Tulse Hill. So this picture shows that location. So we're actually standing on Brixton Hill, looking up the hill towards what's now the Rupel Park Council estate. And that's where sort of Upper Tulse Hill now joins. In fact, the land just beyond Upper Tulse Hill was not part of Edwards' estate and actually developed quite separately as near as small cottages and shops, which fulfilled the useful role of servicing these large suburban estates. Next one. So this is the sort of thing which was being built along what we now know as Tulse Hill and Upper Tulse Hill. So this is the way they developed the estate, with the suburban villas, mostly detached, occasionally semi-detached. And although they look here like sort of two-story houses, closer scrutiny shows there's actually, for example, in the house on the right, there is actually a well-concealed basement or semi-basement for the servants to work in. And sometimes there's also an attic built into that sloping roof. So it's sort of in a very fashionable style of that period through the 1810s, 1820s. But there are sort of little variations. Now, here's some rustling in the distance as somebody is unwrapping their sandwiches. So a reminder to everybody to mute their microphones if they can. Thank you very much. Just to say a little bit about the examples here. The one on the left was Dartmouth House at 96 Tulse Hill. And I should say that Tulse Hill was originally known as Lower Tulse Hill. I think it simply was shortened to Tulse Hill because they felt that lower implied inferior. So it was moved up market very slightly by calling it Tulse Hill. But number 96 began as a simple symmetrical villa, but then it's been extended to the left with a sort of an extra sort of service wing, 2 stories, and a smaller extension again to the right, probably starting as a coach house. And I suspect this particular property was in institutional use by the time that this photograph was taken, because it was being used as a some sort of institution and possibly a hostel of some kind. But if we could actually see the whole of the postcard, we see that it says "with Christmas greetings" in the corner. So I suspect that when the card was produced, probably around 1910, there were probably a lot of sort of regular residents who were in need of sending off postcards or Christmas cards or whatever. So it was worthwhile somebody producing the card in the first place. On the right is number 122 Upper Tulse Hill. That actually still survives within the grounds of the what used to be the Territorial Army Centre. Nowadays it's lost its chimneys and is sort of standing in a sort of splendid isolation. So its neighbour disappeared when the Territorial Army Centre was built. And I have a couple more examples. The style began to change as the estate gradually filled up and buildings sort of moved up and down the hills, as it were, to fill the available plots. On the left, 148 Tulse Hill, dates from 1843. Not a dramatic change in style there, although the basement is perhaps a little bit more visible and a rather grander set of entrance steps. And on the right is number 155 up at 155 Tulse Hill, formerly Silwood Hall, which dates from 1856 and shows a sort of more ornamental style developing in the middle of the century. This survived because St Martin in the Fields Girls' School was built onto the back of the house in 1928. And you can just see part of the school building in the distance on the right-hand margin of the photo. So that is still there as a going concern, with some of the interior details surviving as well. This shows the way the estate was developing up to about 1850 or so. So most of the sites, as shown here on the left, are filled, and it's becoming a matter of filling in some of the sort of overlooked plots around the edges. But there's an almost continuous line of houses all the way up the hill from Brixton, and just a couple of plots left to be filled before you reach down onto Norwood Road at the southern end. I think Trinity Rise was added, well, it's shown here as Trinity Road. Trinity Rise was added probably about 1845 to, again, continue the line of villas down onto Norwood Road. And there are several sort of later examples surviving on the southern side of that road. Dr. Edwards died in 1845. By then, the family were living at Carlshilton, and his wife, Mercy, also died in 1851, as a result of which the estate passed to her younger brother, Jonah Cressingham. He continued to develop the estate on the same lines. To boost interest, he followed the pattern of other developers at this time and provided a site and part of the costs for a church on the estate, which is Holy Trinity Church, which you see on the right there. This was consecrated in 1856, despite protests from the vicars of St Matthew's, Brixton, and St Luke's, West Norwood, who were both concerned that they were likely to lose their most wealthy parishioners. So I'm afraid this is something which a lot of developers were doing at that time in order to create almost an instant community and provide a focal point. It's worth their while to put up a church, and essentially the sort of local residents would sort of rally around that, and anybody moving into the area would immediately have something which they could sort of sign up to. And of course, all these churches in the late 19th century were developing all manner of other activities and sort of social support as well. Of course, there's only so far you can go with this sort of development. So here's a couple of later examples on Tulse Hill. Number 107, which lasted quite well, built in 1865, survived because it was adopted by the London County Council as a children's nursery, and then in turn passed on to Lambeth Council. They in turn then sort of passed it on to the Health Authority, who had ambitions to turn it into a sort of mental health institution and put up a sort of new wing alongside. Sadly, the finances for that collapsed, and as a result, the whole site was sort of taken over and redeveloped, and the original building disappeared. On the right is the very last of these grand houses to be built on Tulse Hill itself, dating from 1888. So have I got a number? Yes, that's number 157. So it's only next door, in fact, or was next door to St Martin in the Fields. So that's completed in 1888. And of course, on the main body of the estate, it's a sort of a rather sort of different society to what we know today. So you've got these large houses with certainly some of the servants will be living in. They'll be sleeping in the attic and working in the basement, very probably. They might be large families, and a lot of the houses will have generous ground, so they may well have a gardener of their own as well. But those residents, quite a lot of the great and the good amongst them, people who are eminent in commerce as well as in various professions. That's a whole sort of study unto itself. So it's a rich theme of potential research for those of you who I hope are infused by this talk to go out there and find out more. But me to do justice to it, I think would take several days rather than the space of 1 hour. I'll just highlight one person as an example, Sir William Huggins, who lived at number 80 Upper Tulse Hill. Can't give you the right dates. Yes, he was born in 1824, died in 1910, still resident at Upper Tulse Hill. He was an astronomer, and in the 1860s, he did pioneering work on spectroscopy and analysing the light from stars and planets to identify the elements of which they were made. He was actually able to make quite successful observations from Upper Tulse Hill in those days. So the atmospheric pollution was not too bad somewhere like Tulse Hill at that time. And he was still sort of active up until his death in 1910. Curiously, he died a week before the return of Halley's Comet, which was one of those topics which he was quite closely interested in. But you know, considering he was 86 at the time, I think that was still quite a good innings for that date. Unfortunately, by the end of the 19th century, the estate was starting to decline because the grand old houses were becoming difficult to sustain, tastes were changing, and more of these large houses were beginning to be used as schools or various other institutional uses, nurses' homes, old people's homes, and various other such institutional uses. And that pattern continued when London County Council acquired a large part of the estate in the 1930s, or from the 1930s onwards. So the house on the right was number 149 Upper Tulse Hill, and London County Council adapted that as a mother and baby home. And it was still in that use when it was transferred to Lambeth Council in 1965. And Lambeth later used it as a training centre for social services. Eventually, it was sold off and reverted to residential use, being converted into flats. So I think the roof you see there is not quite the original. It's been raised slightly to fit more space into the roof. So that is just one example of many, and one could probably tell similar tales about so many other properties on the estate. Going the wrong way. That's it. So there's an official Ordnance Survey map of the estate in 1894. So again, on the right, Brockwell Park has actually by that time come into being. On the top left-hand corner, you can see streets creeping in from Brixton Hill. So this is stimulated by the tram services by then running up Brixton Hill. So the demand now is for smaller terrace houses rather than for grand country houses. And you can see that almost all of the plots fronting Tulse Hill, Upper Tulse Hill, have been taken up, but there is a lot of backland which could still be developed. So that's the position in 1894. Oh, and just at the bottom of the picture, what had been Page's Fields is also now filling up with terraced houses. Okay, so here are a couple of buildings within Elm Park, which is one of the important roads branching off from Brixton Hill and running parallel to Upper Tulse Hill. So on the top left, you have the Elm Park Tavern. So it's a typical building of the 1890s. And then a little later, on the lower right-hand side, we have the Strand Grammar School, which is relocated from central London in 1914, and their building is designed by the London County Council's chief architect, and it opens with a roll of 450 boys. It actually closes in 1977, the pupils by then having been sort of absorbed into the massive Tulse Hill Secondary School, and it spends several years in adult education use, and then eventually it's refurbished as a new home for Elm Court School for pupils with special needs. And looking at some of the other roads coming southwards, yes, Brixton Society actually had a stall at Cloverdale Road Street Party way back in 2008. But the residents there decided to have a sort of celebration to mark the fact that their road had actually been sort of opened up in 1908. So that accounts for sort of most of the houses you see in the background there. But I think that photo is taken more or less at the break point, because development then continues further south towards Tulse Hill in the form of the sort of more typical sort of 1920s, 1930s style houses with their sort of mock Tudor appearance. And in fact, there are a couple of other parallel roads there, which are again very similar. So they're taking up some of the backland behind the houses on Tulse Hill and Upper Tulse Hill. And again, the sort of the changes continue. On the left here is number 47 Tulse Hill, as it now is. In its time, it had been the first of these grand houses as you came up Tulse Hill from the Brixton end. But that becomes, and it's not very visible here at all, but the plaque there should say it's the Sir Henry Tate Memorial Nurses Home. So again, this gives it an Edwardian date for switching to that use. And on the right, we have sort of one of the other changes where the original Victorian houses or early 19th century houses are beginning to be replaced by houses from the 20s and 30s. In this particular case, there's a little group of 3 houses which are in a much more distinctly modern style. But as I said, the great majority were in a much more traditional, what Osbert Lancaster called bypass Tudor, as it were. And then we have the big development by the London County Council of the major Tulse Hill estate from 1937 onwards. The map on the left shows the plan as it was originally intended. Not all of that got built. There are a couple of sites taken up for schools, including the site of what's now Jubilee School, sort of top of the map. And on the sort of bottom right-hand side against the park, instead of becoming a sort of section of the housing estate, that eventually became Dick Shepherd Secondary School. The picture on the right shows that the estate was still being built to the original 1930s design in the early 1950s. The first part was built in red brick, but immediately after the war, it was continued in this sort of yellow sand lime brick, partly reflecting shortages of building materials at the time. And now is the 2 large secondary schools, which were added to cater for the fact that the local population was increasing with these estates being built. So the top left-hand picture is the original Tulse Hill School, which was a comprehensive secondary school for boys, and it had 8 floors of classrooms and then a sort of undercroft, as it were, which included the dining hall and such like, because it's a slightly sloping site on what was, I think, the original location of Tulse Hill Farm. The school opened in 1956 and was designed for a roll of 2,200 boys. So quite a task trying to manage all of that. It closed in 1990 and was finally demolished in 1992 to make way for a housing development around what's now Marnfield Crescent. On the right-hand side, Dick Shepherd School, as I said, was built between the Tulse Hill estate and Brockwell Park. The photo here is from a brochure which marked the opening of an extension to the school, but the school initially is completed in 1953 for 750 girls, and then expanded in 1972 to a roll of 1,200 girls, including a 6th form. So the picture actually shows, in the centre of the picture at least, is the 1972 editions, and just a glimpse of the earlier building on the left-hand side of the tree there. This later became co-educational, but again was closed in 1990 to be replaced by a residential development. Now, if you thought the original LCC Tulse Hill estate was large, well, the St Martin's estate was even larger. This is all the post-war period from 1953 onwards. The first phase, so we're now further up the hill. This is designed by Charles Lovett Gill and Partners for the LCC, but there are also some later 1960s flats along Abbots Park and more 1970s flats and houses further west along Upper Tulse Hill, beyond Rupel Road. So all of that, all those later stages were done by the Greater London Council. Bottom left-hand corner there is the St Martin's Library, as was. That's provided as part of the estate, and also as part of the estate they provided a little parade of shops, which was quite an innovation, because when the Edwards had first laid out their estate, they had included clauses in the leases saying no commercial uses, no pubs, no shops. So all of those types of uses were banished to the edge of the estate. And as the estate was filled in, as it were, with new development, all the new residents had a long walk to reach shops or other services. So this was remedied in the 1950s development of the St Martin's estate. Although the library closed as such, it does continue in a sort of community educational use. And Lambeth Council also got involved in the process of developing parts of the estate with what's known as Cressingham Gardens between Tulse Hill and Brockwell Park. This was Lambeth's main contribution. That's built between 1975 and 1980. From the main road, it superficially bears a resemblance to Stockwell Park and Angeltown estates. But as you sort of progress through the estate towards the park, it sort of steps down in height and scale, and there is more green space. And the whole development was designed to retain as many trees as possible on the site. It does still remain quite popular with residents, despite Lambeth's ambitions to sweep it all away. And there is a plan of the whole St Martin's estate there on the left. But as Cressingham Gardens was being completed, the earlier estates were beginning to show their age. So I think the original Tulse Hill estate, Tulse Hill flats, were becoming less popular by the 1980s, and were therefore subject to a sort of a facelift program called the Priority Estates Project. So we're now talking about 40 years ago, but they'd noticed that people were sort of more reluctant to take flats on the estate, and there were sort of more social problems building up. So initiatives were taken to do something about it. There's certainly still quite a strong sort of community life on the estate today, so at least some of the benefits do persist. In the case of Martin's estate, rather later in the process, this ends up, because of its sheer size, being split between management by 3 different housing associations, or as they're now called, registered social landlords. So this is their sort of collective estate plan, as it were. And of course, there are other things happening roundabout during this period too. So I'm going too fast. Right. To the south of, south and southwest of the original Tulse Hill estate was Rupel Park. That does have its own experts, I'm glad to say, within the Streatham Society. who've published a fair amount about the way the estate was developed, and in particular about the Rupel family themselves. But what survives today is mostly development from the 1890s. Most of the really grand houses, which a lot of them sort of outdid anything on the Tulse Hill estate, most of those have long gone. So largely you have these houses in Palace Road and the sort of lower end of Christchurch Road and thereabouts. And these in turn are mostly now converted into flats. So as I said, these from the sort of 1890s onwards, as the new house is being added to that estate, again, becoming a little bit smaller and more manageable. Down on Norwood Road, which is my next port of call. Yes, here we are on Norwood Road. Well, you have the sort of anomaly of the Tulse Hill Hotel on the left there. I think it might originally have stood on part of land that was Page's Fields, and perhaps the original sort of terms of the lease allowed them to open it as a pub, simply because they were on the edge of the estate and weren't lowering the tone of the rest of the estate. That perhaps is worth a study in itself. But the picture here is taken about 1870, and I use the old picture simply because there's less clutter from the sort of street lamps, traffic signs and everything else, because it sits nowadays on the South Circular Road. But it has managed to retain its original appearance quite successfully. So it still survives. And I think it's probably more from the existence of the Tulse Hill Hotel than from the Tulse Hill estate as such, that when the railway station was built nearby, it became Tulse Hill Station, possibly because there was nothing else roundabout to name it after. It sort of is really sort of plonked down in the middle of nowhere in particular to begin with. But what happens, of course, soon afterwards is, again, we're outside the Tulse Hill estate as such, so their sort of lease restrictions don't apply, and the area between the estate and the station fills up very quickly with lots of shops. So it becomes a little sort of commercial hub in itself, as well as being served by a couple more pubs on the approach to the station. Of course, there's a railway hotel, and there's also the White Hart. Nowadays, the shops in the foreground here on the right, actually in the middle of a sort of gyratory system on the South Circular. So that's made their survival a little bit more difficult. But the fact that they are still there is perhaps a tribute to the fact that there's sort of few alternatives nearby. As you sort of go up Tulse Hill, it becomes a sort of bit of a desert as far as shops are concerned. Around the station itself, yes, here we are. Top left picture there is a view taken as you emerge from the station. This is what you would have seen about 1910. So you have a church here, which is originally the Rupel Park Methodist Church, very grand and imposing. And then you have shops to your right and to your left. And in fact, on the left-hand corner, as you join Norwood Road, is the White Hart. The railway hotel or pub is actually just out of shot on the right-hand side. And you can see the taxi of the time, I think it's a four-wheeler rather than a hansom cab, parked on the approach to the station there. And a very similar view to the right, just below. So you can see that the buildings on the approach to the station are much the same. And the real change is that the church has disappeared, and what they actually did about 1970 was sell off a large part of the site, which became a supermarket and a block of flats and a couple of other shops. And then as part of the deal, they had a new church and community centre built at the back on the Christchurch Road frontage, which became Centre 70. And everybody else halfway. Yeah, I'm going too fast again. That's it. And then this is showing you how Page's Field was filled up in the 1880s mostly. So this again is a mixture of terrace houses and a few sort of semi-detached houses. But again, it's becoming a denser development. So these would have been 3-story houses to begin with, or sort of 2 full stories and an attic. Nowadays, most of them are converted into flats in very sort of different configurations. So that, what you see there is Deerbrook Road, but you've also got Rummeler Road and Deronda Road and Berwyn Road. Next beyond those. That's it. Well, of course, beyond those going northwards, we have Brockwell Park, and Brockwell Hall itself rebuilt in 1813 when John Blades acquires that particular part of the old estate. And then he sort of course, builds himself a new house there in a commanding position on the hill to replace the old Brockwell Hall down by Norwood Road. And initially it is a country estate, but then gradually other sort of interests come on board, and other houses begin to pop up around the edge of the estate, which is sort of much easier in many ways to develop because it's got generous road frontages to Norwood Road and to what's now Dulwich Road. So we've got that, yeah. That's it. So quite early on in 1816 onwards, he builds these few cottages on Brixton Water Lane, which are still sort of standing up quite well. But what I really want to draw your attention to is just beyond those houses, hiding behind the no entry sign, some rather denser development, which is where William Winter's house used to be, but then eventually that plot of land gets sold and redeveloped around late 1870s and is filled up quite quickly with shops on the main road frontages, and then sort of terraced houses on the rest of it, forming Arlingford and Brailsford roads. And we have a few shots to come of some of those shops. So they are, you see at the top left there, as you approach from Brixton along Effra Road, this is how Tulse Hill was continued from about 1880 onwards. So you have 3 blocks of shops, so fairly standard form with sort of 2 residential floors above. And to make the corner place a little bit grander, it's got a quite ornate little attic added to it as well. And on the right-hand side of the road, incidentally, there's some rather sort of smaller, cheaper, and perhaps older cottages, all of which have long since disappeared, but it was rather less grand on that side of the road. The lower picture was really just to show you how that all relates to Brockwell Park. So it's that little piece of land which seems to intrude on the park simply because John Blades never actually either succeeded in buying it or particularly wanted to. Next one. Yeah, here are. So here are shops on Tulse Hill. Left-hand picture at the top there, actually looking from Tulse Hill down towards Brixton. So we've got those sort of smaller, cheaper 2-story shops on the left-hand side there, and the rather sort of larger shops of about 1880 on the right-hand side. Lots of detail can be found there. I think this is probably dates from the sort of very early 1920s, that particular shot. So lots of details there of some of the different traders and shopkeepers were active there. Amongst all of that is a little pub on the left called the Two Woodcocks, which later crops up in one of the larger premises on the other side of the road, which is certainly where I remember it being. I think it recently sort of changed hands and name yet again. So recently had a sort of a new paint job. So go and admire it for yourselves if you can. On the lower picture there is a typical card that a shopkeeper will produce to publicise his business with all his staff and delivery system on display, as well as the goods he sold. This continued as a grocer for quite a long time. Let's see if I've got the other people whose hands it passed through. Yes, it's George Newbery in this picture, of course. And again, that's a typical view of around 1910. But it later became part of the Home and Colonial chain, and then Cullen's groceries, before the whole block was eventually rebuilt. And then finally, because I'm trying to allow myself time for a few questions at the end. Yes, a little anomaly at the Brixton end at number 2 Tulse Hill. A photograph on the left there taken at the very last minute as the building was being demolished. So this was the Brixton roller skating rink from 1910 through to about 1990. Oh, sorry, as a roller skating rink until about 1965, but then demolished about 1990. Oh, sorry, I have got a date on here for demolition. It's actually 1986. How time flies, as it were. So it was all that time ago. But after 1965, it became a carpet warehouse, and then 1986, it's demolished and replaced by a bigger carpet warehouse, and then later that in turn is sold on to Sainsbury's, who I think did a sort of land swap or whatever with Allied Carpets, but essentially it's then taken over and adapted as a supermarket, which it continues as today. But from the poster on the right, you can see its sort of former glories, as it were. That's a poster issued about 1914, when the sort of roller skating and skate dancing was extremely popular. So this is being sort of pushed out as a poster at that time to publicise it. So, right, I think that's the end of my sequence, at least I hope so. Yeah. So I think that still gives us time for some questions, or if I've skated over something which was which you think was important, now is the time to deal with it. So I'll stop sharing and sort of clear that off the screen. That's it. This is a time when I realised just how many people there are in the audience.
Alan, I don't know if you can hear me. It's John Callahan.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just going back to one of your early photographs of 107 Tulse Hill. I don't know if you noticed in the photograph, it's an interesting one because the actual photograph is taken of the house just during the war or just immediately after the war, where the railings have been taken down and replaced with palings. And in the front of the right-hand bay, I think it is an air raid shelter.
That's right, yes. This photograph came from the Survey of London, which was compiled by the London County Council back in 1956. So I would guess the photo was taken in the sort of early 50s, or at least before 1956. So yes, it shows what happened to quite a lot of these properties, that these cast iron railings disappeared and various other sort of alterations sort of bolted on at different times as well. I think it was probably only after the survey was published that these buildings moved towards being listed. So this is quite important in identifying them, but I don't know there's any sort of real protection of the quality of the buildings at that early date.
No, I just found it quite interesting, the difference between the two photographs. You've disappeared from the screen now, I don't know.
We should be on sort of gallery view or something. Possibly if you sort of scroll sort of left or right on the screen, you'll see a different selection of people. So.
Yes, I think the whole thing has disappeared. Oh, it's just a blank screen now. Not sure what's happened. Anyway, it was a very interesting talk, and the photographs are very interesting. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Any other questions for Alan?
Should have a quick look at the chat because I know lots of things have come in there, but
there's lots of compliments.
oh, that's good. Yes, I'll add them to my file of genuine unsolicited testimonials. Yes. There's one saying where the carp is, which is on Norwood Road. Why did the church disappear? I suspect that quite a lot of those old Victorian churches, they were having difficulty sort of maintaining the building, and the congregation was probably shrinking, so decided to do a deal and get a more sort of compact, manageable building, and sort of make its upkeep a lot easier. Someone saying, did you skate over the boards at Tulse Hill Rink? Well, yes, it did have a sort of a wooden plank floor. So this was for roller skates, not for ice skating. There was a big surge of interest in roller skating at the end of the 19th century. And I think Charlie Chaplin, for example, was a bit of a sort of roller hockey enthusiast in his younger days.
Were the larger houses built still leased, or did people buy houses at that point?
Generally, these houses were leased, and typically it was a 99-year lease. So if you bought a house or bought the leasehold of a house from the Edwards in 1824, that means in 1923, the lease would fall in, unless you'd done some sort of deal to extend the lease. So this is partly why we see quite a rapid sort of replacement of those grand old houses during the 20s and 30s, because all the leases are beginning to expire.
So the landowners that had them in the first place were sitting pretty for a while, and then the land obviously reverts to them, and they can do what they like at that point.
Yes, I mean, this is a very typical pattern of development, that a developer will come along and lay out an estate, build houses, let them on 99-year leases, and those in turn, the people who actually bought those leases might actually buy the leases on several houses and in turn let them out to monthly or weekly tenants. So you end up with a sort of pyramid structure almost. And all the freeholder does is just collect the ground rent of perhaps sort of 5 or 10 guineas a year from each of those plots. And then when 99 years are up, the properties all revert to his descendants.
And were there any noted architects that did it? I mean, did they employ an architect for each one of those developments?
We think, I mean, there's a couple of names who are probably more surveyors than architects linked with the actual layout of the estate. But it's probably only a little bit later, as we get to the sort of 1880s, that it's possible to identify individual architects. I think early on it's a sort of a fairly standard product, and it's probably only that you see architects involved, or at least identified, in the later stages of the estate development.
And I guess that's indicating greater wealth and ability to employ an architect and have your own specification.
Well, I think it's also the sort of development of the architectural profession, that there are sort of more people out there sort of targeting potential customers, as it were.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, specialising perhaps in that field. Whereas I think at the early 19th century, architects tended to, or at least the more eminent ones, tended to go for designing churches and public buildings, and then later workhouses and hospitals and so on.
Right, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Interesting notes there about the Tulse Hill Hotel as a sort of coaching staging place. Yes, that's very interesting. Someone mentioned Adele having a flat above the old Co-op supermarket. I'm struggling to remember the names of one or two of the music hall artists who had homes on the estate in its sort of grander days. I think Vesta Tilly at one stage was somewhere on the Tulse Hill estate, but I haven't been managed yet to track down exactly where. Just checking the messages for any other important points. Yeah, for anybody who did struggle with captions and so on, I actually have the text of the talk as a Word document, so it's certainly easy for me to email that to anybody who asks, or I don't know whether it's easier for Len to accommodate, because I can pass it on to him to share with anybody who wants. One day, perhaps there may be a book on the history of Tulse Hill. I remember having a number of conversations over the years with different people who expressed an interest in researching more about the area, but so far nobody has actually come forward and produced any sort of more tangible results. So it's been left in my hands so far, but I'd much rather other people went out there and did some more research.
I asked a while ago if there was any connection between the Rupol parts of that you mentioned about Tulse Hill and the Rupol Street near Waterloo. I mean, is it the same family, or do we know?
Absolutely,
of any
yes. I shouldn't be saying this because it's really the Streatham Society who have the experts on this. But yes, their first development was around Rupol Street, around the back of Waterloo Station almost. And that's from the sort of 1820s or so. And then they later took on the development of a rather sort of grander estate as they were sort of more successful and had more money to spend. They took on a sort of more ambitious scheme around what's now Rupol Park and south of Christchurch Road. And that was, again, at least as ambitious as the Tulse Hill estate or the nearby Clapham Park estate by the Cubits. So yes, so those two areas are connected.
Thank you.
Right, can I go now? It's getting near my.
I was just going to jump in and say thank you very much, Alan, for something that was so engaging, so well illustrated, so clear, and so comprehensive. That was very, very kind of you to talk to so many people this evening. Our next talk, before you all go, is on the 17th of February, and it is Alison Wilson, and she's talking about Clapham in World War II. So we can all look forward to joining that evening.
Yes,
So-
thank you, Alan, from a resident in the area. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, right. I have to go, so I'll let you chaps go as well.
Okay, I shall.
Right, good night,
I'm
folks.
about to end the meeting for all. A very good evening to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Len. Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.